We're starting right here again on the physical practice program with the upper body strength and mobility section. Now, one thing I'll say about upper body strength and mobility, I use this term as well as lower body complexity in the online support program. And the reason I categorize it like this is not because I'm stuck in this perspective of the upper body and the lower body and we separate these things. No. It's just the convenience of programming. This is what we're working with. A program for me is essentially creating on a piece of paper using classical programming methods from the world of strength and conditioning, from the world of fitness. It's a modality you can use in order to provide people a movement context. Just as well as you could, for example, if you have a party with your children or something and you might make some games and you make some rules, you make a movement context. This is a very convenient movement context, programming, in order to provide someone movement contexts at a distance, for example. But upper body strength and mobility, it's a very, very general category. So yes, we can look at classical bent arm strength, straight arm strength. We can look at conditioning work. We can incorporate rehabilitation, but it kind of starts to blur with other aspects when we look at more full body movements that we will today, such as things as even this table extension or the box exploration. Also things such as with the large frame mobility, like the bridge rotations. There's aspects of course, the full body in there. But upper and lower body complexity is given just as a structural term. Au cortado, we'll jump straight into this. If you're not familiar with au cortado, it basically just means it's a cartwheel, a cartwheel, and it's a short one. Cortado, yeah. It comes from the world of capoeira. I was personally introduced to this movement before I started briefly playing capoeira, of course, through the material that was provided very prolifically by Ido online in his Floreo series, of which many people have benefited and gained insights from. And from digging into these movements and then also looking at them in the context of, for example, play in the game of capoeira, in the roda, you get two different perspectives. So the first perspective, and this again ties in with this idea of the multiple function of movement contexts, it's kind of a weird term, but anyway, it basically means you can get more than one thing from one specific context. The au, for example. Just briefly, if you're not quite sure, au, yeah, so okay, this is my kind of A position, and then when I come up, I have my O position, and then I come back and I have my A position. This is the A, U, the cartwheel. But in any case, in practicing this in the initial instance through the progressions that Ido provided on his videos, you learn them in a very, very structured way, which I found extremely beneficial. It helped me develop a continued understanding of the movement, a progressive layering and understanding of the movement. But when I found myself personally proficient and able to perform an AU, when I went to the roda, I then realized that I couldn't use it. So now we have the idea of an applied movement context. I learn a movement, I can hang from a wall, I can move about and things like this, but can you climb row? This is the applied movement context. So what I have to forefront with the AU is that when you go through this, it's not going to serve you as a movement in the beginning. And the movement is the AU, it's dynamic movement through inversion. And it's locomoting at the same time because you're moving through space. It will not serve you in the beginning of the progressions. It may feel very, very mechanical, very, very restricted. And this is the point. And this is the point, to build that certain foundation to then be able to use it in an applied context. And the reason for this is as well, is that I've often met many people who these movements that come from capoeira, or the solo work, the floreo capoeira, in some cases, in the act of movement, people perform them seamlessly, like it just falls out of them, like it flows out of them. But then sometimes when you take that out and you look at it specifically in its isolated context, if you try to slow it down, for example, if you take some of the dynamicity away from the movement, in some cases, it then doesn't even function. We want both of these spectrums under the concept of having movement potential, or movement control. I can do it slow, I can do it fast, I can do it moving in directions, and so forth. So briefly touching on the progressions, this is why it was so nice as Ido presented it, that we started off quite simply with the AU entrance. And so this was the thing that I liked to emphasize as well. It's just entering into the AU. And the most important thing with regards to a movement perspective for this movement is that it's lateral. The movement is lateral. It goes through the frontal plane, but it's lateral movement. I'm going this direction. So in many cases, what can happen is that we can default to a push-up position, which is a linear or a sagittal pushing pattern. It's not the same. So let me briefly show you the difference with the first progression, the AU entrance. First of all, keep yourself looking directly forward. Very often, I know this from my own experience, most definitely, is that there's a tendency to look at the floor. There's two reasons why you want to avoid this. Firstly, because if I look at the floor, it starts to turn my body into this type of push-up position. And secondly, I don't get the added benefit of training my vestibular system in dynamic inversion. And if you're like me, that I never came from a background of doing backflips, of doing somersaults and things like this, it's not built into me. So I had to teach myself this, but I had to force it. So quite simply, when you're working with your AU, I think it's nice in the beginning just to feel this side to side movement first of all. It's kind of, imagine you're at a concert, like, yay, but you're kind of doing it in a squat. This is the movement because it's going sideways. And with the early progressions, there is a very nice, again, the multiple function of movement contexts. You may be able to take advantage of a mobility stimulus, which is not too dissimilar to the scorpion tail earlier on in the programming. And I'll show you why. Because when we go in, I place my hand wherever it kind of feels comfortable. I want it to feel natural, but ultimately, if I'm going to the side, it's around about the side of my foot, not too far back, not too far forward, but just where it goes here. And then I continue with this overhead, and I keep going. This leg now needs to extend to help me up. Whenever there is flexion in a limb, in the body, in an arm, in a leg, whenever there is flexion, there is movement potential. It can extend and it can contract. The same with the arm here. If I find myself with a bent arm, I know that I could extend myself backwards using it as a support. So there's flexion here. If I use that flexion, I extend, it helps me up. I keep the heads between the arms. Now, if you find yourself in this position and it's feeling a bit, tight and restricted, fantastic, because you're going to take advantage of the mobility aspect of this movement. And the mobility aspect is here. Again, the anterior hip, basically hip flexors, that we mentioned with the scorpion tail movement in the first webinar. Now I'm moving to this side. I'll do it slightly to the side of the camera so you can now see this leg. What happens is I pull the heel to my backside to open this hip. And for some of you, this is going to be enough for the moment, just holding it. That very, very first progression, and you can get the mobility benefit from that. So I open, I pull the foot back, I extend as much as possible. You might even get some nice funky hamstring mobility stimulus going on here, even better. Pulling that hip back, pulling open, stay looking through the middle, and then to the other side. And now, even if you are super restricted and you can't even get straight leg and you're just pulling and pushing at the same time as much as you can, what you can do is focus on this transition. Yeah? And again, this comes to the mindfulness in movement. So I move to one side, instead of just coming, that was tough. All right, next rep. Stay inside the movement. Even if you're restricted, you can still feel the kinetic potential. You can feel the kinetic energy that you can go with. I go with it. I continue, I continue, I continue. If you are getting the mobility effect, hold it for a few moments, yeah? Take that end range, hold it for 3 or 5 seconds, even just like, stretching out, open it, pull it, and bring yourself back down to the middle. Now, the reason that this feeling of the side to side, I feel is so important with this movement is to be able to bridge that gap with what I said previously, which is essentially using the movement just as like an exercise, an isolated context, and then actually applying it and moving through space. Because the fact is, when we start working with the earlier progressions such as this, there is a danger. And the danger is that it stays as an exercise. And this can happen when there is no experience or understanding of what the full movement ultimately becomes. So, while you're here kind of just going side to side, this isn't really kind of what happens in an owl. This isn't really the purpose of an owl in terms of locomoting through space and going through inversion. And so even this initial entrance and this trajectory that you're building here, it may not be completely accurate until you actually start to experience the full pattern of going through owl, 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 and coming back again, which is one of the progressions, the circular owl, I believe, should be in there. We'll get to that in just a moment, but just to come back to the earlier progression, some common mistakes. We'll come back to the first one, which I spoke about, which was turning the body. This is very, very common because it becomes very similar to other movements that people are familiar with, which is basically your yoga down dog. Or more specifically, the scorpion tail. It can turn into a scorpion tail. It's not a scorpion tail. Remember, scorpion tail is working in this plane, in the linear plane, and opening that hip here, in the sagittal plane there. But this is coming sideways, sideways, sideways. So that means that more or less, if I'm going in this direction, it should follow that hand, hand. This is the most common thing with cartwheels. Hand, hand. I want to move in that direction. Hand, hand. There's a sequence. What can often happen is, I'll do it from here, I place hand, but then I kind of place the other hand in front, and then I find myself kind of just in this position here. Again, the scorpion tail, which is not what we're looking for with this. Emphasize the lateral movement. And this can feel somewhat a bit scary if you're not used to this movement, just because when you get to here, very often people just want to get that hand down straight away. But what just happened? I put the hand down, and now I'm not even leading myself in this direction because the hand needs to come over this way. But then what if I'm so mobility restricted that I kind of can't reach there? As your project grow, as your project get the hand down, which comes to the second part of this movement with regards to actually supporting the movement, which is starting to feel yourself supported in the hands and the shoulders. I mentioned this with the fingers routine and the wrist routine that's in here, is that dead hands, just on the floor, just with nothing, do not provide anything useful, when it should be the foundation and the earthing of your movement. This is where it starts. So as I come here from the AU, I grip the floor, I feel myself nice and sturdy, and now in the very early stages, again, if you're unable to fully stack your weight, you may be kind of to one side and more loaded in one arm, but feel yourself supported on that arm. This is not necessarily a straight arm strength context. You don't have to keep the elbows strictly bent out. In actual fact, when you get into the more dynamic AU, some slight elbow flexion, again, is going to give you some potential for further movement. So for example, as opposed to going complete straight arm here, and it becomes kind of pressed handstandy, if I have slight flexion, I can pull, I can push, a slight push from that slight flexion in the elbow. But in order to make that work, I still need to start building this experience of the stability in the middle position, which is essentially being stacked over your shoulders, which are then stacked over the wrists. Always asking yourself the question, which I always present when people are working with progressions for two-handed balance, is, are these hands and these shoulders, do you feel confident in putting your weight, your entire body weight on top of that? If the answer is no, then there needs to be some adjustment, because that's ultimately what's going to happen. You put your whole body weight on top of it. And this is why these progressive entrances I find so nice, is because it allows you to ask yourself that question. So once you have found yourself able to get into this kind of position here and quite stretched out, you can then work with, of course, the small heel lift. And the function of the heel lift, you see I've got the flexion here, it's because I'm going to use it. Yeah. So with the function of the heel lift is that it then brings my center of mass more over the shoulders. So it's like, Of course, I'm pushing strongly through this arm here, but because it's stacked, now these are shoulders I want to put my body weight on top of. Okay. There comes a time. There comes a time in every person's training project and every person's practice when you have to jump without rope nor net into the unknown, without rope nor net into the void. What is he talking about? I'm basically talking about the point when you do the jump. This is also something that if you're sharing this with people who are kind of just beginners and they have no experience with going upside down, they can't even do a normal cartwheel, and perhaps you're exposing this to them. Perhaps you're using it for that context of mobility aspect, also just trying to expose people to something a bit different. At some point, they will have to jump if they want to make the connection between the exercise and actually using the movement. Because at the end, it's just a movement. Yeah, there's this nice, I think it was Bruce Lee, but I read it from somewhere, the perspective that, when I came to this movement first, it's just a movement. When I started learning something about the movement, I thought, oh, wow, this is a little bit more than a movement. When I started practicing more and I understood the movement, I realized it was only a movement. Yeah, so these stages, this circling of coming back, the learning process, when ultimately from learning something you realize, it's only that thing, but you have to go through the learning process. So continuing through the learning process, when we jump, the jump, it could more accurately be called a pop. It's kind of pop, this thing here, okay? Now, when you pop, you then have to catch on the arms, and then you've got the aspect of, the hand balancing aspect, if you're taking it in a controlled manner. So the progression with working with the pop would just be a moment to say, just to come back down, and then I would go to the other side. So I just work here. It can be just like this. This is no problem. And you'll feel that some reps will be like this. It'll just be like, I didn't even go anywhere. I continue. And then the next rep, you might find, something caught. And then you go to the bad side and it'll be like, this side isn't working. The practice, it's the practice. So chase as you progress, chase this sensation of basically becoming supported over the shoulders. This is it. With the AU, when you start essentially bringing it more dynamic and working all the way over the top, there is like a sequencing with the legs, which can be very, very helpful. And I can also tie it in again with this idea of open hip that we looked into with the scorpion tail in the first webinar. And basically, when you come up here, avoid closing the knee. Yeah, again, closing the hip. Again, it's something that can be related to physiological restriction, like it's really hard to open, or people can just feel really exposed, being really boned out and opened up, you know? And again, as long as that hip is closed, it's going to be more difficult to learn the entire movement, because just as in your tuck handstand, the counterbalance, think about it, yeah? If I'm doing an AU to the side here and my legs are closed, where is the weight? The weight's at the front, and the weight pulls me down. Same as a tuck handstand, yeah? If I've got my knees tucked to the front, but my bum doesn't come to the other side, no, the legs pull me down. However, if I open myself, if I open the feet backwards, the legs now, show this better, instead of being closed here and pulling me down, now it's open. Now I can stack. Now I can get into basically a handstand position to go over the top. It can feel very exposed. It can feel very open. And if you do fall, good. If you don't fall, you're not practicing hard enough. Yeah, your success rate is only in relation to your failure rate with these types of movements when the sensitivity is involved. One thing I'll add with the AU before just lastly going into, maybe I can fit some circles in here, we'll see, is that I would not treat it as a strictly progressive movement until doing the AUs, like the full circles or coming back and forth, going over the top. I would not necessarily stop yourself from going or trying to go all the way over the top if you're just learning the first progressions. In actual fact, if you're working with this programming, I would encourage you to do, for example, one session with the strict type of entrance, and then the other session just trying a pattern, jumping over the top, seeing how it works. Because realistically, any able-bodied person can do an AU, which is why in capoeira, once people have practiced for some time, even if their physical capacities in terms of mobility and strength are still terrible, they can do the AU because it's a movement pattern. Yeah? So don't restrict yourself from taking that jump and trying it, because as I said, until you actually get the feeling of where it actually goes, you're practicing the initial instance. It lacks information and it lacks sincerity, because you end up just working the exercises without an understanding of what the movement actually means. This is very much where I found myself in much of my physical practice in the past, which is why now a lot of my practice at the moment is just applying things that I've learned. And of course, it continues on a daily basis. So going into the full AU, once you're feeling this is working, I can do an AU here, and I can come back and forth, I can slow it down, I can come through. This can happen. If nothing eventful like that ever happens to you, you weren't practicing hard enough. So the circles is essentially just taking that AU for a drive. So now it becomes vitally important to have embodied this feeling of the flow from side to side. I come through here. I lead into the next owl. And I can direct it. So of course, I'm making this circle quite small because of the camera. And what happens here is, see this arm that's leading? Well, what? It catches and it leads me again. And when I go back, it leads me. And then you see that ultimately the movement just becomes a movement. At the end, it's a circling. Just with regards to progressions for this, if you're feeling very, very proficient with the movement in a controlled manner, a really nice one that you can combine with essentially kind of hand balancing and also working with proprioception of the legs, some segmentation mobility in there as well. And it's just the side flexion, emphasizing the side flexion, which basically means I come into the position here, I come up onto my hands, and as I come down here, I use this foot as a target and I pull it towards the ground, much as you might as if you're doing like flagging in handstands. And then I can reverse it back the other way. Work with pauses as well during the different places. Work with entering and pulling it back. And again, this is kind of an expression of ownership over the movement. And it can also be very nice in terms of the texture. I like this idea of kind of, you know, I'm going this way, am I going this way? Oh, am I? Oh, no, I'm coming back. That was a bit of a fail, but you can enter in through the side and then pull yourself back again. These are nice things you can practice if you're looking to dig deeper into that, if you do already have some proficiency with the movement. Any questions on the owl? I think I pretty much covered everything with that one. Anything? Anyone had any tricky issues in the initial instance, or anyone not being able to get into the position, or any other issues such as that?
Is handstand a prerequisite to do that move?
Is someone contributing?
Yeah, is a handstand a prerequisite to try that?
No, not at all. No, not at all. There's no prerequisite to it. So, I mean, as I mentioned previously in there, is that this is something that it's literally child's play. It's literally child's play. And some people can feel very, like if I say this to people like, oh, you just call it child's play because you can do it and I can't do it. It's like, no, it's one of these patterns. It's in you. It's in you if you follow the movement, the dynamicity of the movement. However, if, you know, as I mentioned, you come to these things as an adult, like myself, then you just have to undo some layers. It's more a removing than actually necessarily a building. And that removing is very often related to just essentially fear of failure, fear that I can't do it, I don't have the capacity. And in many cases, you won't have the capacity because of that internal angst, that second guessing, that questioning, maybe I need to be able to do a handstand before I do this. But one of the reasons I actually brought this in here is because we have the wall-facing tuck handstand progression, which although it serves multiple contexts, as I said, it's very, you're stuck on a wall. Even if you're doing the back to wall handstand version, it's very handstand, hand balance world. Yeah, get the shoulders in the right alignment, open shoulder, keep the elbows locked. This is useful in this area. You start taking it towards more dynamic, more free-flowing moves, like for example, from the world of capoeira, it doesn't mean anything at all. In many cases, it can be a hindrance. From all my years of learning to hand balance with looking at the floor, then when I went to capoeira, I realized I didn't have the orientation to even hold like a 15-second handstand looking straight ahead. So it's not a prerequisite to have a handstand in order to practice that movement. I would just dive right in and yeah, get practicing. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, good. Okay. We'll go on to the Negativa push-up. The Negativa push-up, Negativa de Angola, whatever you want to call it. Again, this is inspired by the videos from Ido's Floreo project. And the reason why I put this in here, of course, it's a push-up movement, but it's a specific pushing mechanic. It has a specific pushing mechanic through which it, well, when being introduced to this movement, the Negativa push-up, it starts off very inefficient before you ultimately build what is the goal, which is the efficiency of the movement pattern. So if you've taken a look at the video and studied the idea of the elbow position and actually taken it into your practice, incredibly important, because the amount of times, you know, I've provided these to people and then even emphasized, check out the elbow position, and then you see a submission and again their elbow is to the side. It's like you didn't reflect on your own practice. How was that practice? Yeah. So if you did reflect on it, you should note that this pushing mechanic has the elbow extremely close to the body. We'll dig into this specific movement as it's presented at the moment, and then we will look at some applications afterwards and why this Negativa push-up contains a concept, a great pushing concept, and not just an isolated pushing frame in itself. So just to give some context in the world of capoeira, it's used as an evasion. As a, you know, say if someone comes to kick me, I can come down out of the way and I can avoid their strike. And there are two variations which we provided. I believe in the world of capoeira, they would be considered from different styles, from different types of capoeira. That aside, I've taken them as a leg forward and a leg to the side because it provides a progressive structure for it. Because the leg forward is kind of essentially easier. And then the leg forward does also mean that, you know, if you're extremely restricted, you know, I've done this with people who almost have no squat or very limited mobility and very little body awareness, but because you can basically just also sit on the floor. And this still patterns the mechanic we're looking for. And the mechanic we're looking for, I'll just do it sitting on the floor here so you can see, is the pressing with the elbow close to the body. And again, note what kind of naturally happens with my arm here. I'm not just doing this to kind of look cool, but the reason is if I have my arm here, I don't have as much counterbalance, and the weight isn't as nicely distributed as if I'm opened up here and I can direct myself in and out of the movement. The elbow position is essentially as close to the body as you can keep it, as opposed to what is often seen for different pushing mechanics, which is elbow at 45 or even elbow straight out to the side. This kind of pushing mechanic here is normally, you know, the complete newbie push-up position, which is not optimal even for a horizontal pushing mechanic. 45 is more where you might find, you know, your bench press and you know, stronger type of maybe even protracted push-up position with the lats kind of locked in there. This is even closer. It is not queda de hands. What does that mean? It means I am not resting my body weight on the actual elbow here. This is not something that happens. It goes behind here. So you can see this quite clearly in the video, so I'll just demonstrate it a few times. As I come down, I shift my weight. Part of this movement is about structure. Actually, no, that's the whole of it. It's all about structure. Now, when you're learning structure of a movement, how to structure your body, which ultimately is completely integral towards understanding and developing the mechanic, how can you develop a correct pushing mechanic unless you have like a structure to sustain it? And in order to understand the structure, you kind of have to feel, you know, what doesn't feel right here. Like if you feel really kind of cramped and you can't move, chances are the hand is probably too close or the wrong position or the foot. You need to make adjustments for your structure and your body in this context in relation to the level that you're currently at or your experience with it. Level, it's not like one above, we just have different experience, okay? So with this particular movement at the beginning, you might find, even with this progression, like, man, I cannot, load all my body weight into this arm. I have to use both hands. That's absolutely fine. And embody at the same time this feeling of whoop, and then to the other side. Now, I can't remember, I'm not even going to look at the programming, if it's alternating or just all on one side. You can do both. If you want to just work one side, just like this, and then just pump out, you're going to be working more of that strength aspect of it. However, if you're alternating, it helps develop this kind of patterning of work back to the squat, transition through. Look at the foot switch. Back to the middle, transition through. Instead of going like, if you find yourself really struggling through the transition, then perhaps it would be ideal, even if it feels easier, but to work alternating so you can pattern that middle transition, the same as we were talking about with the owl going over the top. Now, in reality, as the practice improves, it should get easier. And this might sound obvious. Of course, you practice it, it'll get easier. Yes. However, I don't mean easier in terms of your strength will develop. It's strength that develops in relation to having a more efficient structure, but in relation to strength in terms of, the cross-section of your muscle fibers and the potential of those muscle fibers to create a contraction, to then create force, this is not really developing so much with this movement. It's not a strength movement. But what does develop, as I said, is the structuring and the patterning of it. So when it starts to feel easier, in actual fact, when I'm coming down on this arm here, I feel like there's not really any weight in it at all. It's just a structure that I'm kind of, I'm sustained. My body is sustained on the tension of my connective tissues in that position. But only if I'm structuring myself in such a way that happens. So if you start feeling that this is getting quite proficient, okay, I can work this with the one arm, then move to the lateral variation here. This is much more challenging. I remember the first time I tried this, so it was like, this is an unfeasible movement. It's an unfeasible movement when the practice isn't there. This is quite self-explanatory in terms of in the video. One thing I will just say is that if you've moved to this progression, just ensure that when you're coming down, you're not doing things like resting the leg on the floor. Likewise, one big thing with the pushing mechanic, and the same as with the owl, it's a lateral mechanic. The movement is lateral. We're working in the frontal plane, which means resist the very common push-up. If it starts turning to this, you might as well just do a push-up, because this is not what the movement is about. It's not a turning onto the side here, which is why I would strongly advise you to get the leg to the front, pat down with one arm before moving to the other variation, just because as this one is harder, if you're also working a lot with the other hand, you're a lot more inclined to turn the body, and it must stay sideways. Let's get to the reason why it's sideways and why I provide this as a pushing context. The Negativa de Angola, as I mentioned, or just the NBA, the Negativa push-up, is an evasion move in capoeira. In order to evade the incoming golpe, you want to get close to the floor. It's a floor entrance pattern. Not only is it a floor entrance pattern, so now we have entrance to the floor and not floor contact. It's not floor contact, it's floor entrance. Now I have this position. Okay, I have an understanding of it at the other side. Okay, if I can coordinate these movements, I can locomote through space with close floor locomotion in much the way of a very, very popular locomotion pattern for its what it contains, which is the essence of this close floor locomotion. You'll immediately recognize as soon as I do it. So from here, my NDA, I have a support here. I make another support. I place a support, and I shift my body to the other side. Again, I'm in my NDA position. Okay, I have the stability here. I place a new support. I shift my support to the other side. And I'm getting a very lizardy-like crawl now off the back of my understanding of a low pushing mechanic, a close floor pushing mechanic. Was taking that to the lizard crawl, and I wasn't going to throw lizard crawl in there because it's many variables in there that mess it up. And one of them is that very often people approach a lizard crawl as again, essentially in a push-up position, working in the sagittal plane. And it becomes very, 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 very difficult. If you're working a type of a lizard crawl like here and here, this is not efficient for moving along the floor. More efficient for moving along the floor is a rotational texture in which I move myself from one support to the other support. I'm shifting, rotating from one side to the other side. And if you look at any videos of the people that you follow on Instagram or wherever that show this movement pattern, if they are proficient with it, the best is to look for the ladies who have mastered this pattern, and yet you were perhaps other guys have huge muscles and stuff, and then they struggle with it because they have the efficiency, which is the beauty of this movement. So if you have the efficiency of understanding the different supports, the movement, which starts off as it can be known as a strength type movement, soon becomes about efficiency and also using that to move through space. One last thing I'll add with relation to the MDA, also this torsional aspect, because if you don't really get it here, there's not much torsion. You will feel a twist, the torsion in the torso, but of course it only really happens then if you're switching to the other side, as in the lizard crawl. The reason I say this turning is so important, and to perhaps avoid the more facing against the floor, pushing mechanic like this. The reason why this is not very functional. It's not a very functional lizard crawl. You would just need to take your camera right now and turn it the other way around and look at this floor like it was a wall. And if you do bouldering or climbing, you will know that as soon as you see someone climbing like this on the wall, the only place they're going quickly is down. Again, I speak from my experience. What is more effective on a climbing wall is the ability to keep your body as close to the wall as possible through this mechanic of the twisting, getting close to the wall, such as here. If I'm reaching, I come sideways. If I grab something, I have more potential to reach if I'm sideways. It's the same as working against a wall, but you're working against the floor, which is why, the climbing wall, if you're doing some bouldering, could also be nice if you're feeling up to the conditioning, is then to throw in some lizard crawls afterwards for some structural balance aspects of it, if you're looking for that conditioning aspect. That's everything I wanted to say about the Negativa push-up. There is a lot to it. It can reveal a lot. It really does contain the essence and the seed of this type of pushing mechanic that I feel is really, really lost from even the world of calisthenics. I was working in calisthenics, and you have the archer push-up, but it's not the same. And it's the same with the archer push-up. For me, if you're doing an archer push-up in the world of calisthenics, yeah, okay, you come down to the one side, but it doesn't have this rotational aspect here. It always is somewhat loaded on this side. So it never builds that understanding. You will not find it in the world of fitness. That's why I thought it was very valuable to put in here. Table extension, rocking, iso hold. No need to go into that. I will just say that as well as for shoulder extension, you can go on about shoulder extension for ages. It's just often largely lacking in programmed practice, I feel like, shoulder extension contexts. And shoulder extension, which is of course coming behind here, it does just not, it's not only, oh, okay, I take a heavy bar in my hand, I bring myself down, and I work with this movement, oh, that's shoulder extension done. Yeah, okay. It's like lifting your arm up in the air in front of you and going, oh yeah, that's my whole arm, straight arm range taken care of. No, it should do many different things. So the table extension here, it has kind of a dual benefit, even in quite, it's a light context. You can certainly load it up actually in this. You can load up this context quite a lot by just shifting your mechanics slightly. So for example, hands forward or backwards, I'll get to that in a moment. So I can really load this up if I choose to bring it right back here. Oh, yeah. And now what I've got in that position, I'm in shoulder extension, but I'm also pressing backwards through the floor. So I'm building active shoulder extension, albeit in this, it's just a closed kinetic chain environment, okay? And you can also work, you know, of course, the open kinetic chain, you can work with things like German hangs to help develop your shoulder extension. But, you know, with a German hang, for example, it comes very, very close to just passive stretching. In some cases, even though that shouldn't be necessarily the case. So this shoulder rocking, that's one thing that you can work with a lot. And if you find with these extensions that you cannot get your hips up, and it's more the case that you have a lot of tightness across the arm, invest in this frame. Be mindful, however, because if you come from a background of a lot of this, which again I'm fully familiar with, you will find that a lifetime of this soon shows itself as neglect when you visit a moment of this. It's essentially the opposite movement pattern of the thousands and thousands of contractions that happen here and the zero extensions that have happened here. Maybe in a dip or something, you've been in shoulder extension, but bent arm, straight arm shoulder extension. And this can be a really, really great movement because it has this rocking aspect and you're supported on the feet, that it's not too intense. And you can really find the places, such as maybe a little bit higher, where it's like, oh man, that is, yeah, I can feel that's something I need. Hand positioning, if you are purely developing, you just want to develop your shoulder extension range and also easier to push through the floor, is having the hands backwards. This having hands backwards, it basically externally rotates you. When you're externally rotated, it opens your chest up. You can enter a more thoracic extension a lot easier as opposed to being more pronated. However, if you turn the hands pronated, what will happen? You may be more restricted in the shoulders. You may even just find yourself down here. But there's a beautiful kind of, there's a torsion aspect that then happens through the forearms and the tissues of the forearms. And one thing I think I mentioned in the previous one as well is that, you know, these can get really, really glued up, the forearms. So from, you know, working on the floor, working with hand balance practice or whatever it is, locomotion practice that you're doing, this can actually be a very, very nice therapeutic tool. I very often use it in the middle of my sets of handstands. I just get on the floor. I've been working handstand, you know, flexion, flexion, flexion all the time. So I would personally always advise, and this harks back to Stephen Lowe's very popular book, Overcoming Gravity. I would always advise to pair handstand work with shoulder extension projects. Hence why normally when people work with me, we always work on a road to basically kind of mana projects. Not that I want everyone to be doing manas, but just that I want people to be exploring the shoulder extension, and we can combine that with handstand practice. Last thing I'll say with the table rocking, which I said I wasn't saying anything about. Anyway, If you remember from the finger and the wrist mobilization routine, I talked about gripping into the ground, feeling the fingers tight so they're not dead hands, so it can emphasize kind of like an active type of stretch. Instead of just passively torquing myself in this direction, I'm kind of almost pulling against it. I'm gripping against it. The same thing can happen here with the hands forward. So as I've got my hands forward here, I'm kind of externally rotating even at time to time. So that basically means my hand is fixed, but external rotation then causes my elbow pit to face upwards. This then causes a very, very nice torquing, which is essentially like supination of the hand. And it's almost like a therapeutic isometric contract, relax for the forearms, which has helped me a lot in class, that's for sure. So yeah, just as you're exploring this, explore hands back and hands forward. One last thing I'll say just briefly about the hand position here is that I do encourage you to explore both. Not least because we're working in both paired contexts, external rotation and internal rotation of the same position, but also because in terms of internal patterning, if you're kind of entering the floor, if you're kind of walking along the floor, the hands forward is actually a little bit better. Like if I fall back and my immediate mechanic is this, and I fall into my hand, you're going to bust your wrist. It's nice to have a pattern in there as well that has, as I fall down, I push the floor away. If I have a constant idea that I always have my hands facing back, it does affect your patterning when it does need to come out. And I can tell you that from experience. I've been in situations where I've fallen backwards and I put my hand back and thought, wow, that was a stupid built-in movement pattern. I almost broke my hand. So then some patterning of the other side is also beneficial. Jumping forward from that to box exploration. This is a nice context. And you've got a nice drop set. And I would personally get that drop set up to 30, 20, 10. 30, 20, 15 even. We've got 20, 15, 10 at the moment. Get it up to 30. It's a revealer. Again, just as a Negativa push-up can be a precursor to understanding of the lizard crawl as a locomotion pattern for moving through space, the box exploration provides a fundamental understanding of what I call the bear crawl, quite simply. I have a friend who calls it tiki-tiki or something. It's amazing. I just call it bear crawl. Now, the reason the box exploration is so beneficial is because it's anti-rotational. It's an anti-rotational position, which basically means you are fighting the body's efficiency reflex of twisting in order to make it lighter, to make it feel lighter. What do I mean? So basically, let's start from the beginning. Box exploration. Box position, it's all in the video, but basically, make sure your box position isn't a push-up position. Make sure your box position is not a squat position. Record yourself and review it and check that, boom, your immediate position. 90, 90, 90, 90, more or less. Again, we start the frames quite restrictive and dogmatic. This is how we begin. When you're using it afterwards, as you like, during the learning process, we stick to the structure. And now I'm in this position here. If I take away one of these supports, I'll just take one away, watch what the body wants to do. Oh, yeah, it's falling here. So what the body would want to do is turn this way, because now it's more supported. Now my load is more directly over my arm. The same as within the Negativa push-up. This is a kind of a nice default position, because then it's nicely stacked over the support, as opposed to being here, where it kind of then spreads the load down this way and pulls me down. So here, the body will naturally, to make it mechanically efficient, want to go, simple, easy life. Likewise, if you take away a foot, and the hip wants to go down, this is a nice thing that your body will do as well. Yeah, turn so it can support itself. Likewise, if I take away 2 points of support to leave me in a 2-point support position, a contralateral 2-point support. Contralateral, talking about anatomically, we're working with the opposite sides of the body. It's a very, very rudimentary explanation. And when I shift onto 2 points of support, what does my body want to do? Where is my center of mass? My center of mass is still here around the hip area. That's where the weight is. So what the body wants to do is this. And now the weight just hangs down here and it's nice and supported between these 2 points. This would be a rotational movement. Rotational is mostly associated with efficiency in movement, and there are very many reasons for this anatomically. We saw it in the lizard crawl, right? It has the rotational aspect of efficiency, but we're not trying to be efficient. And I spoke about this previously as well. Sometimes we want to be really efficient. You're building a movement pattern, you want it to be efficient. You don't want to be pedaling your bike in such a way that it just completely destroys you. You might hypertrophy your legs afterwards. I used this as a method previously in my bodybuilding days for conditioning, but it's not efficient. You know, I'm destroyed after 10 minutes of blasting it on the bike. What we are looking for in this particular pattern is inefficiency. Searching for the inefficiency. Now, how do I know where the inefficiency is? Well, quite simply, is when it's harder. It's when it's harder. And not only does the body very often try to evade and work around the very physically taxing tasks and make it more efficient. I'm kind of now, we always say the body is the best cheater. You cannot separate your mind from your body. It's a cultural thing, which basically means that if you find yourself going for the more efficient pattern when it's supposed to be inefficient, it's you. It's you're finding the easy way out. You're avoiding it, and that's straight to the face. You're avoiding it. Quite nice. I was watching a Shaolin documentary last night, and one of the Shaolin masters was talking about the current people that come and practice with him. And he basically said, yeah, today these quote unquote kids, 20-something-year-old men, he said, yeah, they're nothing like the people I used to train with. He said sometimes they stop during the movements. Sometimes they get tired very easily. They don't keep working until they're completely, this is Shaolin Temple, of course, until they're like sweating and dying. And one thing he said specifically was they very often change the movements to make it easier. They change the movements to make it easier. So I'm not quite so sure whether this idea of making things easier that I often see is necessarily just the body does it. I feel it's a cultural thing. I feel it's an ethic in practice thing. Make it difficult. When you're in this position, I take at the same time, just situate myself so you can see, at the same time, I test, I push through the floor. I don't want to find myself sinking down with an anterior tilt here. Just keep a strong position, pushing through the floor maximally, feeling myself tight, and then lightly, just back foot over here. This comes up at the same time as the right foot. Now, I have got a line of tension that crosses from my shoulder diagonally through down to this leg here, which is being supported. Now, what I want is that you can express the possibility to move these two limbs so that I could place that here if I wanted to and have a new support. Likewise, I could place this foot here if I wanted to and have a new support. But again, this feeling of making it difficult, if you need a visual reference, for it to be anti-rotational, it means that if you watch this knee here, this knee does not rise, the knee does not drop. The pelvis does not move in space. From this position, what happens? From here, there should be almost absolutely invisible, nothing's moving in here, nothing at all, until I then replace And then I shift, take a moment. As I shift, feel the tension, lighter, lighter, lighter. And then it comes off of the ground. 30 seconds one side, 30, 20, 20, 10, 10 is a nice goal. We start with 20, 15, 10 each side. If you are bringing that into a locomotion pattern, all you need to start doing is shifting your weight and place and replace the bases of support, which is fundamentally what locomotion is, quadrupedal and bipedal, sorry, when working on the hands and the feet, and which as I mentioned in one of the videos from the proofing series. So just to give you a brief idea, if you then did want to explore the bear crawl, rather than getting on your bear crawl, I'm going to do bear crawl, it's fine, I can crawl, easy, got it, done. I don't need to practice that. But what did I spend 1 year of my life on that I wasted? No, these bear crawl patterns, when done with the same intensity, the same intention of this anti-rotational idea, it becomes a very, very, very focused and strenuous movement. And so from here, the foot and the hand leave the floor at the same time. There is no tuck, 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 tuck. At the same time, I go straight from 4-point support to 2-point support. The knee goes to the direction of the wrist. It doesn't touch. It goes to the direction of the wrist, and I replace. I shift my body weight, foot and hand, same time, come up. I push through the floor, place. I'm pushing through the floor still, and I replace. I push through the floor, and I replace. Without respecting this anti-rotational idea, it starts to look like this. The backside is shifting from side to side. Extremely efficient. Not so good as a training tool, which is essentially what we're using this for. Ido once described it as dynamic stabilization in motion. Following that up quite quickly with, you never have to do a plank again. These are the words from him. One thing you can do as well, if you're working with this bear crawl pattern, if you decide to use that somewhere else in your practice or in the program, is to place, get like a stick. You can place a stick, or even start with just a small weight plate on your back and place it across the back of your pelvis, the sacrum here. Not up high on the back, but just on the pelvis here. And basically, this will do the telling. This will do the telling if the pelvis is moving. And you could even use this in your hold for the 30, 30, 20, 20, 10, 10. Yeah, that would be a good one. So you can use that, and also as you're locomoting through space, if you're using the bear crawl variation there, or completely different movement really, this stick can be a nice friend. One of the next programs I'm hoping to when I get around to it, to writing, will be the fundamental floor communication. And fundamental floor communication will involve essentially some of these patterns. So if you've worked with daily practice phase 1 and 2, even though it's not, then the programs aren't necessarily linked and it's not really progressive. I try just to give people a wider experience as opposed to, oh, you're level 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not what I'm about. Yeah, but you will be able to bring that experience to that other practice as well. It would inform it. Nice. Cool. Oh, we're heading downstairs. Lower body complexity. Again, I've said this elsewhere, but I'll touch on it now. Lower body complexity. I don't put everything in this way just to say, oh, now is lower body day, here is upper body day. There's nothing wrong with this. But if it's just very, very strictly, or it's just only leg stuff, blah, 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 it can skew perspectives of movement, harking back to the idea of separation of body parts with classic bodybuilding training, which I was heavily involved in. So again, I use the idea lower body complexity just as a very, very general subject. It means that you can also within that explore bipedal locomotion as well as prehabilitative variations, as well as even lower body mobility. It can tie in also with we've got the bridging here, which is this low bridge? Is it upper body, lower body? It doesn't really matter. There's a reason I put it in here, which I will touch on. The first thing we will touch on to get straight to business is the shrimp to arc and reach. Now, the shrimp to arc and reach, will break it down, of course, firstly to the shrimp squat. And can't remember who it was. Chris, might have been you that posted a video or something. But in any case, I see it all the time. And again, this is not you're doing it the wrong way. It's just I propose it in a certain way. It is also a way that was proposed by Ido, if I remember correctly, and it just stuck with me because it made sense. Is the idea that the shrimp squat is a starting strength movement, a starting strength movement. And why is this significant? Well, first of all, it'd be nice to draw a more common parallel of what is a starting strength movement. A deadlift. A deadlift, when you pull from the floor, is a starting strength movement. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant because of the structural aspect. If you've deadlifted, and I'm sure if you're joining this webinar, you might have in one form or another at some point in your life done a deadlift, and known that one of the most important things about the isolated context of the deadlift is your form. What is form if not structure? Why is structure important? Because it leads to mechanics. Why is mechanic efficient? Because then it provides the most efficient way of lifting a weight and getting a certain desired effect. So the mechanic of the shrimp squat, or the deadlift even, if you don't have that ideal form from the beginning, then it will be revealed to you if it's a starting strength movement. It will be revealed to you either by the physiological sensations or when reviewing back your videotape. Now, what am I talking about? So let's say, a deadlift. If you're starting from the deadlift, of course, you need to lock in, set yourself up, get everything set. Okay, this is a strong pulling position. Okay. However, there is always the danger for a beginner in many cases, starting from top down, that kind of, you just start rounding with the back. The execution of the movement, the trajectory of the movement is not so well mapped because the position wasn't practiced in like an isometric type of form. So in a way, when you're setting up for a deadlift in the beginning, I'm completely aware that coming from top down can also help many people to understand the deadlift movement. But in starting from the bottom, you can feel that lock-in when you're ready to pull. That lock-in, that's what we're looking for with the shrimp squat from the bottom position. That's the long story short. Starting with the shrimp squat, if you're new to the movement or you are providing it to people that you think would be beneficial for, and there's many benefits. I won't go into them because I've spoken about them elsewhere, but if you want me to touch on what I believe the benefits of the shrimp squat are, ask me afterwards. But set the parameters of the movement, always first of all. The parameters of the movement here, which are quite explicitly written in the description, is that the back of the front knee comes in line with, so the front of the back knee comes in line with the back of the front foot in this position here. This is the position that I want to start in. This is the position that I want to return to. Why is this? Because again, there are certain compensations that your body will try to make, which either can extend to you bringing the leg too far back, or more commonly, bringing the leg in too far close, basically collapsing. This position kind of allows me to, but this is what I'm looking for, a strong pushing mechanic. So set these parameters first if you're working with someone. Another thing is that, as I'm sure you know, because you've probably tried this movement and at some point been a beginner in it, is that she's a deceiver. She's a deceiver. There was that Jane Fonda crap. And then you try it, and you're like, oh my God, I cannot stand up. It's a fantastic moment, yeah? So give the person that you're introducing it to, give them straight away the option to push with the back of the foot through the ground, yeah? Unless you want to expose someone's weakness for some reason, then you can just say, yeah, lift the foot and just stand up. But in any case, give them the option to press from the ground, because what this will help with is them to maintain the mechanic for what is a very, very intense movement. I mean, we're working this, I personally never worked shrimp squats for over 6 reps each side. It's not, I didn't use it as a conditioning tool. It's a very, very maximal strength tool. So from here, the weight is shifting forward. This is also something that you would give to someone or should be aware of. And again, this can be facilitated even further by a counterbalance of the arm. Now, if I'm pushing from the floor, I extend, and then I can bring myself to lock out of the hip. In your top position, contract the glute, lock out the knee, squeeze the quadricep. Yeah, this is just the shrimp part, just to let you know what we're looking for. I go from here, if I'm pushing from the floor, lock out knee, contract glute. Now I'm standing upright, okay? Instead of opposed to just kind of coming here and not really locking out, half wishy-washy stuff. Yeah? With the variations or the progressions, of course, you start changing holding the foot or having the foot up. But I will advise, however, rather than just sticking to the idea of it would be great if I could hold this with 2 hands behind me. What would be greater is actually knowing where you are. Where are you on the progressive scale? And one thing that can skew your perspective of the progressive scale, which is the holding of the hands or things like this, is if you have this thing going on, yeah? Oh, and you pull the knee in and completely alter the structure of the movement in order that you can get up. It's not in keeping with the perspective of practice, which is respecting the model. So with regards to the model that we're looking for, it would be much better, for example, rather than here with one foot and then making it up, that you can perhaps just work with the one hand and keep that back hip from closing. Keep it open and load it into the leg. Lo and behold, it's perhaps even more difficult than holding with 2 hands, and it's a much more controlled environment. That's to be said for the shrimp squat. Now, with regards to the arc and the reach, I love this integrated movement. It's great. I really, really like the context of the reach, which we have seen in, maybe it's in daily practice phase 1, I'm not sure. But the shrimp to arc and reach, we are working with straight leg strength in a compression context as well, and we're working with patterning of the hip, and there's other things in there as well that I will explain. But in any case, it can be an extremely frustrating movement, because again, it's like Jane Fonda shit. And you look at it and it's like, okay, and then you try it, and then you realize the restrictions. Perhaps you can only lift your leg to here. Absolutely fine. So just to remind you of the movement, I come up from my shrimp squat, I bring myself up, I lock out of the glute, quadricep, staying tight. From here, keep this knee deadly locked. Keep it locked. Avoid flexing and trying to let your body compensate. Really, really keep it locked. Where possible, lock out at the knee. This is negotiable, most definitely, because some people just really, really restrict. But if your mobility is quite good, then that's the range that you want to be working into. You want to be working into, rather than here, work a locked knee range, even if it's down here. We'll see what happened then. Yeah, straight in this, and it dropped, just to show you that these compensations can happen. Amazing boy. So I brought myself up from the shrimp. I come up, shrimp squat, stand. Keep it up in front behind. Now carve it, keeping your body Try to keep it completely straight, carving it around, find that goal. That's the position, yeah? Feel that it has that internal rotation aspect as you draw it around all the way to the back, and the work is not done here. Because what I have here, I have my hip is not square. Square hip is this. I have also called this open hip as well, but it kind of gets confusing because it's not open hip in the sagittal plane. We're talking about open hip now in the frontal plane. But this is what happens from the front view. When I draw it around, normally I'm going to end up passing through this position, and the tendency is then to close off and start again. It's not finished. Close back to the horizontal pelvis. I bring it up, around, the pelvis naturally opens here, and then I bring it back down. That was the moment. That was the big shot. From here to here. And then I bring it back in, grasping of the heel, bringing myself down as lightly as possible to the knee, really putting the intention into that last part of, woo, that was too heavy. Lightly coming down to the ground. Now, the importance of this closing of the hip, it's not minutiae here. Again, it's a fundamental mechanism in the body. I have not been to many ballet classes, but this is spoken about in these environments when these things are used, which is essentially the mechanic of I have my hip square or it's open. Square, and you can even see, like here, if I have my foot there, if I open the hip, it turns to the side. This is the hip shifting open and closed. So being really strict with that aspect of the movement is going to teach you this idea of the opening and the closing of the hip, or the moving between, this angle, diagonal angle here, and then closing it back to horizontal, squaring the hip, which is it's proprioceptive. It helps you build an understanding of your body, and it will ultimately help make that movement in itself a full circle coming back to close, which is something that we'll touch on with the bridge rotations, the wall bridge rotations. The idea that if I'm coming here and I just stop here and I just come back, it doesn't really finish the movement. If I open here, I have open and then I close and I come back in. Okay. Lastly, with these, it can be a difficult movement if you get into a groove, get into a flow. Yeah. You should have seen already the mindfulness in movement perspectives video that was there. So in the context of this, it really is, I set up, shift the weight forward, get a flow, bang, come up, straight, lock out, arc, comes around, open, close, pull it back in, bringing the leg to the front. Again, contract that glute and the knee as well, and lock out the knee to then bring yourself back down. Try to make it feel like this type of almost military presentation parade that you're going through it. That's all there is to be said for the arc and reach. 6 reps each side of that. It's a killer, as one of my students in class would say, in the French part of Switzerland. It's a killer. 6 reps each side, which I gave you the option to bring it down to 3 if those reps are taking you a lot of time. Last thing, with regards to the balance aspect of this, if you are working, encountering the balance aspect, fight it. The floor is lava. It's a very, very famous game we all played for many years. The floor is lava. If you have to touch a finger down to the floor, if you have to shift, if you have to jump your foot, you just lost a life. We have limited lives in this game of life. So really, really put that on yourself. Fight yourself. Fight to get into balance. And it would have to normally require you to pause in that moment in the movement For example, I just worked up here. Maybe I got through my shoulder squat. I got here, and then oh, I start to lose balance. Okay, pause it, find it, and on with the barbecue. Yeah. So these small details are what will separate you from just essentially repping out. Because if you're not focusing on those bits, then what are you doing? You're just trying to do it just to get it done. This is the opposite of the perspective that I'm trying to promote, which is this mindfulness, which is practice, basically. Okay. Any questions on the shrimp to arc and reach?
I actually have a question.
Yep.
It's okay to use a supported version on this exercise?
No.
No, not at all. Okay.
The reason I hesitated to say no, because when you say is it okay, of course it's okay.
Yeah.
You can use it, but it will be the same. You will have taken away a huge aspect of the movement. Now, this is the same very often with the sissy squat that people ask, can I hold on to something? It's kind of like, yeah, of course you can hold on to something, but then it's not the same thing anymore. You don't have the stability or the balance aspect. Is that important? It most certainly is. It's mandatory for the context. And you see this very often when movements are abstracted from different places. So of course, this has an essence of this this arabesque ballet position. It's not so far as to call it an arabesque. But in any case, with that movement, the reason that movement is so profound in the world of ballet is like, a 0 point. I use this term as a 0 point, is because it shows something. It shows you have mastered that form. If you can balance on that one leg in that position, then you have ownership over that place. Now, in the practice of that, if you were continuously holding something onto something, the question that I would then put back to you is, okay, then what point then do you let go? How do you know? When you feel stable, how do you know you feel stable? Because you've been holding on. It will ultimately slow your progress down. I say this just because for years when I first visited the sissy squat, the sissy squat is something I started in like maybe I remember these dates because I was in Korea, which is in like 2014, maybe 5-6 years ago. I had to hold on to something, but it was because I had actually taken it from the world of bodybuilding, from Tom Platz, friend corrected me recently. He used to use it in his practice. And then, of course, I was using, that was in 2011, actually. Then in 2014, 15, when I started using it unassisted, in those 3 or 4 years of using that movement assisted, when I went to unassisted, I was like a complete beginner again. So I just used that 4 years, building some physical capacity, but not actually building ownership over the position itself, which ultimately becomes a 0 point that I can move through. If you do have people that have instability issues or they have fear issues and you want to get them introduced to this, by all means, you could use them in the very first instance.
Yeah, just in the first part, just to get like the right direction during this the shrimp squat.
Yeah, see, here's the other thing as well. It wouldn't be necessarily the right direction, because when you're holding on to something, it changes the mechanics of the movement, because you're applying, you're giving pressure to something else, and then it kind of skews it. A very easy example of this is the calf raise, which I give to people as well. Everyone does classic calf raise, so I'm on a deficit step, I do my calf raise, I'm holding on to something. Okay, you may have done these calf raises for 10 years, 15 years. Now do the calf raise bilaterally at a 1-1-1 tempo. So 1 second down, 1 second hold, 1 second up, 1 second hold in the top position with locked out knees, and you are not allowed to hold onto anything. It will be like you've never done that movement in your entire life, because it becomes a completely new context. So whilst in the beginning, yes, you could give that to someone as a, to stabilize them. always keep in mind that you are not working some of the aspects that are innately in that movement. I would personally never even give someone the option to hold on unless it presented to me like, okay, for what reason or other, we can't do this unless they hold on to something. But in all honesty, I think that most able-bodied people can do a shrimp squat using the back foot assisted on the floor, and they will, okay, be very, very off balance during the movement of the leg, but hey, you give them 1 repetition each side, and it takes them 60 seconds to do that 1 repetition. They lose their balance at some point, they have to stop on the floor. Better to stop and support here on the floor for a moment than hold on to this. Much, much better.
So it's better to keep the foot on the floor than just use for a moment something for the momentum that bring you up. I don't know if it's clear. Yeah, it's better to use a scaled version.
Yes, yes, okay. You said it exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, you said it exactly. Better to use a scaled version rather than change the movement, which, okay, as I have to say, it would effectively be changing the movement. The heart of that movement would be gone from it. Clear. And this is why, in so many cases, I give this the reach, just the isolated reach to so many people, because it's a revealer. It can't stand on one leg. It can't stand on one leg and dynamically move the body on it. This is not the thing to say, oh my God, you can't stand on one leg. It's more to say, look at the potential, the practice that's there, just standing on one leg and reaching. Like, this is if this is difficult for you, what an opportunity. Because when you become proficient at this movement, you can think back and go, like I often do, like, man, I remember when I was holding onto those sissy squats, and then to see, wow, yeah, there was learning that happened in that process. So, as you said, better to give it scaled and the same type of movement rather than using external, something external for balance.
Okay, clear. Thank you.
Yeah. Nice question. Thank you. Any other questions?
Jason.
Yep.
It's okay if we don't touch the heel on the floor while we're doing the shrimp squat?
Very, very good. Very good observation. Very nice question. Yes, it is absolutely fine. I'll quickly touch on that so people understand what we're talking about. We're talking about the heel. Just correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you're talking about if you do the shrimp squat. So my heel here is flat, and then if I come here like this, whoop.
Yes.
Yep. Yes, it's absolutely fine. Keep in mind though that it's a thing. Yeah, why is that some people are flat-footed when they do it? Why do some people shift onto the toe? Why do I, in some variations, stay flat-footed, and why do I, in other variations, choose to go onto the toe? It's a different lower. Let's go back to the first of all to the reason for it. It's essentially related to dorsiflexion. So dorsiflexion is just this. If you're limited in dorsiflexion, then yes, because of the limitations of your connective tissue, you're more likely to be forced to shift the weight onto the toe. If you have more dorsiflexion, then you might find yourself, if you can keep the foot flat and then shift the knee right forward, keep this flat foot position, then of course I can get this forward lean, but I can push, looking this way, I can push flat-footed. So this is the reason, and now let's speak a little bit about the differences then. One is a squat in which your weight is evenly distributed throughout the entire foot. Heel, I think we speak about these 9 points of the foot. We have the heel here, the 5 fingers, and the 5 pad, the other pad at the front. But when everything's flush to the floor, as it should be with a normal back squat, a bilateral back squat, you can actually push with more pure force. You can get a lot more of the, for example, the posterior chain in there as well can be more activated when you're flat-footed on the floor. So this is what a flat foot mechanic will give you. If you don't have that range and you're forced to move more forward, the stress is going to shift more into the anterior side, which is basically going to be your knee and your VMO, the vastus medius oblique, the teardrop muscle, which is hugely involved in stabilization of the knee. Now, there's, of course, a great benefit to that. You get all this benefit of building the stability of the knee. So in actual fact, what I would normally say is that if you do have very, very good, if you have a lot of dorsiflexion, I would actually be mindful that you're not using that as kind of like a cheat. And again, because the shrimp squat for me is largely focused, it's like an advanced prehabilitative movement. For me, a shrimp squat is like a Peterson step up on steroids. Yeah. So with this idea, the forward loading of the foot, which basically means from here, my weight is more forward into the toe as opposed to just being flat and now my load goes directly down. Here, it's more loaded to the knee. This is actually desirable in this movement. So what I actually found, interestingly enough, is as my dorsiflexion increased, that in the earlier progressions of the shrimp squat, I found I was able to keep my foot flat. And you know, the not so diligent work ethic of me guy was like, oh wow, this is so much easier now. And then of course, in the other person in my head was like, well then why are you doing it like this? And if it's easier, why would you do a movement easier? How is that going to contribute? And then I realized, okay, yeah, I actually need to consciously shift my load forward and not do it flat-footed. The flat-footed is absolutely fine. I wouldn't say to anyone, oh, you need to do it flat-footed, but here is the reality. If you progress forward to the hand-holding version, like this hand-holding version, if I try to keep my foot flat, air doesn't fly. Like if I try, it doesn't work. I can't do it with a flat-footed mechanic because I cannot fully get that mechanic locked in this position. I have to shift the load into the toe forward, bring the heel up, lock out, and likewise, what I would then do on the eccentric is then really find the position. Where does it shift? Where does it shift from flat foot? Where is the point where it goes naturally onto the toes? As opposed to, for example, which I see often with the sissy squat, is when people go up onto the toes and then come down. It's not the movement. It happens naturally as I come forward. So here I would question, okay, where is that point? Okay, now it's coming on there. Now I need to put the brakes on. It's just shifted all into the knee. Now I need to slow it, slow it, slow it, slow it, slow it. Boom, comes down. Okay. So yeah, great question. It's absolutely fine if the heel rises. Just be curious. Why does it rise? Why does it rise in some people? Why does it rise in other people not? What is the difference between the heel rising or not? Again, it seems like minutiae, small things, but it's really not. Completely changes the entire movement. Thank you for the question.
Nice, thank you.
No worries. Now, the shoulder bridge, again, what is this Jane Fonda crap? Shoulder bridge, glute bridge, potato, potato, tomato, tomato. I call it a shoulder bridge because I'm doing a bridge position and I'm putting my weight into the shoulders, which is actually why I choose to call it a shoulder bridge, because a glute bridge, it almost feels like I'm doing this for the glutes. It's not necessarily what I propose as being focused on in this movement. The shoulder bridge is a very, very useful movement, although I think it was called once by Poliquin a useless movement. So it's kind of a bit heavy, me throwing it in a routine after really knowing that a complete don in the world of where he is in physical performance and competition, like Charles Poliquin, to say he thought it was useless. I basically put it in here because in my experience, I have seen many people with very, very fundamental instability translating into just really a shit weak midsection. We can call it core, we can call it core, okay? And what this basically expresses in is just people's posture. I even see some very well-trained individuals. You know, I came from this place, but their posture is just consistently like this, consistent posture in this way. And also, when you start working with certain movements, it shows itself and it becomes kind of a weak link. And in many cases, people can start working some advanced pushing or pulling mechanics or body weight things, and actually that fundamental area is still showing itself as lacking. And something like the shoulder bridge not only has benefits I'll speak to for the posterior chain for the legs, it is also kind of the flip side of working something like the box exploration. So in the box exploration, we're maintaining this idea of neutral spine, but generally to encourage neutral spine, we have to say lumbar flexion and posterior tilt. So yeah, a neutrally type spine. We're in the prone position, and now kind of shifting it to the supine position. So one of the things I like to emphasize when you're practicing this movement is avoid hyperextension of the spine. It's very easy to do because it's very easy to think that, you know, I'm pushing the hips up as high as I can, which is again why I was drawn away from glute raise, a glute bridge, because, you know, when you're thinking just focusing here, you're like, oh yeah, I get that thing right up, yeah, that's good, you know, get those buns in, okay? Yeah, well, two reasons that this is suboptimal perspective. The first reason is that you're only thinking about this and nothing else. Whereas, a matter of fact, this position can be used for many things. In the world of, for example, BJJ, if you're framing or something, or if you're moving, I'm not a BJJ expert, I'm working off kind of secondhand and very limited knowledge, so feel free to ridicule me with what I'm saying, but from what I've seen is that this can be very useful in giving yourself space, so you can get in and get out of places. But with this, I'm maintaining tightness through here so that I'm not arching in the lumbar spine. Keep that locked in tight as you're squeezing the glutes and pulling the midsection in tight, and it will contribute towards the development of what's his name again? Patrick. His name escapes me. Authority on back pain. And this is actually one of the fundamental movements he mentioned as well with the plank, but again, he's coming from a very traditional type of physical practice background. These isolated frames, Stuart McGill, in terms of helping stabilize the spine. So my response would then be, okay, contralateral box exploration, and work some glute bridges, bilateral and unilateral on the other side as well, towards that kind of lumbar spine stability development. But there's a second part to it, which is related to the rest of the posterior chain from waist down. Specifically that I'm pulling with the heels. There's always an aspect of pulling. Try to avoid the feeling that you're pushing through the ground and pushing the hips up. It's pulling so that consistently the posterior chain is active from bottom to the top. This is one reason why this can often be discarded as a movement, but it's a double heel hook. We spoke about this heel hook as well with the Cossack squat. In a deep position, I heel hook, I pull myself to the other side. The heel hook that you see in climbing, but it requires conditioning of the posterior chain. It requires conditioning of the connective tissue behind the knees, and this very isolated, simple context can provide that in small quantity, and over time it can contribute. So the floor variation, I would say, avoid flat foot, avoid just pushing up, because look, my hamstrings here are like almost completely not even active. I want them locked in. So I propose work at around a 90-degree angle minimally, and I'm pulling the heels through the ground. I come up high onto my shoulders. Again, I'm avoiding arching in the lumbar back, and now I'm pulling, and these hamstrings are completely active as I hold the tempo, which I believe might be 5 seconds. That's a good one. 3, 4, 5. Now when you come down, it's coming down. Touch straight back up. 1, 2, 3. Contract, contract. 5. Touch. Touch straight back up. Don't relax on the floor. Even down in this position here, I'm still pulling. I'm not here and then I relax it and let it all off. And it's an isolated context enough as it is, but intensify it. Make it always tension. Keep the tension there consistently. So as I'm locked in, I'm pulling nice and tight. The other thing to say is that avoid rolling down the spine and bringing yourself down. Hinge. So from here, I stay nice and tight, and then I hinge. I try to bring the upper back down flat and then straight back in. So this is 5. I come back down, touch, and then straight back up high onto the shoulders here. The way I would work through the variations is I would start on the floor, start with the floor variations, the bilateral. After some weeks working with that, then go to the unilateral on the floor. After you've had experience with that, work elevated bilateral. After you've had experience with that, work elevated unilateral. And then lastly, working to the open, more open angle pulls, which I'll touch on just now. And this is kind of a cycle that you can keep on doing, because ultimately, I personally now use this as more of a neural activation exercise or drill before working things such as back squats or front squats or even deadlifts. It's very nice to be able to work with some releasing of the hip flexor. However you choose to do it, just work with some releasing of the hip flexor here, and then working with priming of the posterior chain, and then hitting some deadlifts or some squats or something like this. It can be very useful. The last variation, the open knee variation, again, it just emphasizes this idea of pulling with the heels through the floor. But now, because I extend it out further, it's really, really loading in the knee. So from here, I'm extending a bit wider, there, just to this point here, and I'm just pulling. And it's almost, again, it's almost at a straight angle. But now, this is like consistently loaded. If you're doing this with one leg, that's heavy business, heavy business. I personally don't use it unilaterally, the really extended variation, but it's a possibility you could go there. Yeah, so much to be said for more Jane Fonda business on the shoulder bridge variation. We're going to go straight in and look at low-gait balance progression, the low-gait balance progression. Yeah, Fabio, we'll come back to that idea of the stability work, but maybe time that, bring that in at the end. This is also related to stability. The low-gait balance progression is something else, as Andrea mentioned, with regards to holding on to something, that you might be tempted to hold on to something if the balance essentially is not there. First of all, why are we learning this movement? Well, on a physiological level, you're working with the deepest, sorry, I just put myself thing. You're working with the deepest flexion you can possibly get in your knee. So you're working in deep knee flexion, as well as you're working in in maximal toe extension, which again can often be something very, very restrictive, which can also lead to limitations in dorsiflexion of the ankle. So here, this position here, and in this deep knee flexion. Now, again, if you haven't much visited these ranges because of limitations, then you can find this very, very intense on the knee. You will have to manage this yourself. There's nothing wrong with kind of just hanging out just in a position just like this with your hands on the floor. Again, I prefer this to using something towards the side because you can start to lean and it changes the mechanics. at least here, if I'm working here, it gives me more of an opportunity just to keep the foot here, or at some point when it kind of gets off the floor, then I can take it off. So we're working with deep knee flexion, toe extension, and the other thing is more to the movement perspective of things is we are mapping a 0 point. We're mapping a 0 point. This has already been talked about, and it is also in the Cossack squat perspective. Remember, we said the perspective of the Cossack is that I'm choosing a trajectory at which I could go to sit on the heel. And from sitting on the heel, I have optionalities here to use for something. I can shift. These are points of support for locomoting. I can make another point of support here. I can shift to here. And again, I never have another point of support, which is independent of the other leg. Now, one thing that is very often in the beginning is you kind of just take any position that you want here and just sit on it, absolutely fine. But at some point, it may pay to start exploring the positioning of the foot. It doesn't have to be like super upright with the foot, but there is a difference, for example, between kind of sitting back down here like this. It's different because my dorsiflexion is not representative of the general population. But from here, sometimes it's better if we can just shift it. There we go. Now I kind of shifted it a bit forward, as opposed to being sat back on it more here, shifting it a little bit more forward. It centers you a bit more on top of your base of support. And these are just some of the nuances that you can check out. Start conditioning the ranges to be able to withstand 15 seconds of hold time, balancing before adding another range position. So make sure that you have the balance to be able to stay in this position for 15 seconds before you start exploring the other sides. You may start to find that these ranges are limited due to mobility. Well, we are also taking care of this circular range with things like the arc. It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same movement pattern. But now you're performing it in a low-gait context as opposed to a standing context. Now, one thing that's really, really nice to bring yourself to is the around the world. It's a nice, I don't often set people off on benchmarks and goals and things like this, but it's just nice to say, okay, if I can do this, I've milked this context for all it's worth. And what that thing is if you can do 15 in this position, 15 seconds, without stopping, 15 to the side position, and then likewise 15 seconds in the back position. If you can clock that off, that 45 seconds time under tension on the one foot, and it's doable, practice that for like 6 to 8 weeks, chances are that range isn't going to be an issue for you. And what do we mean by that range? What range does that bring? Well, one very, very now more commonly used movement as well, which is the duck walk. And the duck walk is essentially low-gait locomotion, low-gait bipedal locomotion, yeah, duck walk. The duck walk is almost like this, but in motion. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, the duck walk, I'm walking in a squat and place the foot. I pull with this foot to replace myself onto the heel, and then I take another step. I place the support, I pull myself onto it, I re-support, and then I go to take another step. It's, sometimes you see it as kind of like like struggling along. In my perspective, it should be used as a tool to pattern low-gait bipedal ranges. And the way that you can then integrate it with this, and again, you could even do like a few weeks with this in the program and then switch up for the duck walk, about a 10-meter length, is the idea of essentially extending the time spent on the one foot and drawing that arc out wider. So whereas it's perfectly fine to do a duck walk just here and the knee kind of sweeps out, and yeah, this is nicely mapping the ranges of the hip, sitting here. This is nice, but what we can also do is we can extend this duck walk so that when I come to bring the foot to the front, where is it? It's in the back position of the low gait. I swing it around, I extend the leg, I bring it to the front, I place it, I pull back to the other support. Where am I now? I'm in exactly the same position. I control it. I enjoy this time on one foot. I place a support and I pull myself again. And this way, we then start to use these ranges in the low-gait position with a locomotion pattern at the same time. So this is just an idea of where this movement kind of integrates. But fundamentally, it's building that 0 point. That 0 point of on the heel, when you're sitting on the heel, which could be a place to relax even. And it's a 0 point, if you remember from previously, because it has high transitional movement potential. There's a lot of things I can do in that position if I can own it. We'll shift straight forward to the low bridge slide. Low bridge slide, again, is completely one of these things that are related to structure. Again, touching back on what we said with the NDA push-up, also the Negativa push-up, even the box exploration, is that when you don't know what the structure is, when it's not embodied in the beginning, yeah, it feels heavy. You feel like you're not strong enough. You feel like you don't have the mobility. Normally, I would always retort back and go, okay, how much have you actually practiced? Because it is a structural thing, which means it has to be embodied, how to position yourself through practice of the movement. Don't get me wrong, of course, there most certainly can be mobility limitations with these movements. Once again, we are working in the position of deep flexion here of the knee, quite specifically, but now we're working with open hip, right? There's an open hip position, which basically means, again, my hips are open, but now it's loaded. The first variation, now if you're someone or you share this with someone and they have no chance in hell of getting themselves into a low bridge, then you use this as a loaded quadriceps hip flexor stretch. That's what you can use it for in the beginning, and it would not be the full position. What it would be is the first half of the slide. You would get people, they bring their feet straight in. Be sure that the feet are hip width. Make sure that the knees are also following that same trajectory. One thing that can happen is that the knees splay outwards. And again, this is essentially avoiding the most restricted range, which is the hip flexor, and trying to shift it to the range of the adductors. And this is again, it's bypassing it. To basically go to the place where it feels most stretched and stay there. So when you have your person here or yourself, you bring them in, slide. The first thing to do is to make sure you slide enough and not too much. There's a happy middle ground. The happy middle ground is when, boom, I can feel it here because I have that embodied. It's when the knees are kind of toward horizontal in the same line with the heels. But more specifically, it's a position in which from here, I can push my feet through the floor. I push through the balls and I can just get some elevation. Keeping the backside tight here and here. Again, it's like that glute bridge context, but now we're loaded. So from here, I feel the weight is all in my legs. This is such an important thing with the low bridge movement. It's in the legs. It's not in the arms. When people say my arms aren't strong enough to hold the low bridge, well, I mean, does that look like strength to you? There's nothing, it's not in the arms, it's in the legs. It's in the legs. Because what happens is I create a bow-like structure, a bow that increases tension, boink. And this is the bow-like structure. And the great thing about a bow-like structure is that it has spring to it, and spring carries load. Boing. This is what we're building, and it's essentially what is a low bridge if not a bottom position of a sissy squat, sissy, and then coming down. So in the very initial instance, if the arms are out of the question, take this, load it up, build time under tension around like 30 seconds, 15 to 30 seconds, 3 reps of 5-second holds, 1 rep of 15 seconds. 5 reps of 6 seconds, sorry, 6 reps of 5, or 1 30-second hold. Aim for, in the really introductory instance for around 15 seconds of accumulated time under tension, and then bump that up to around the 30 seconds accumulated time under tension with that movement. That would be if the arms are out of the question. What that would do, of course, it would take care of some mobility restrictions, but then it's also building half of the experience with the pattern, and then you just have to implement the arms. Now, the arms here are essentially front squat position, yeah? Get those elbows up. So you know already that if you have issues with your front squat, which is essentially issues with external rotation, your arms in the bridge are not going to be so usable because they're going to be restricted. So there are other things that you might have to take care of to negotiate the arm position here. Of course, it can be done. Seen it done. So from here, as I slide forward, when I get myself up into the position, I'll just show you straight away, just so you can start to look at the structure. The review of the structure is always very useful. With the knees, as a model, the knees at the same height as the heels, forming almost a 90-degree angle here, and then you've also got like 90-degree extension of the toes, staying tight in the midsection, staying tight in the lumbar spine, and now it's just a light push from the arms to stabilize and get me on that boing, 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 boing. The boing is all in here. The boing is all in here. And one thing that I will add to this as well is to note the structure of the arms. Again, we're not pushing here, but we have a support. And now if you have a vertical load, what is the best support for a vertical load coming down from the top? Yeah, best support is a column, a straight pillar. So if you're holding this position and you're finding the arms aren't doing much, and then you look at your video, which you should, and you're kind of like this, well, what can you say about these arms in the beginning? It's not a really nice structured position to support a weight on. And likewise, if I find myself like here, like this, again, it's not really a great structure. I want to more look at elbow stacked above wrist, going down through the ground. If I can go, boom. Now that's a bit more in the position that we're looking for. At the head position, relax the head and find yourself with just a few centimeters clearance above the head here. Look, so I can just kind of move it about. Be sure you're not shifting yourself too high into high bridge territory. Yeah, this is just a high bridge without my feet on the floor. It's a low bridge, and again, the way that you can tell the difference is when the load is in the legs and the hip flexors. It's loaded in the anterior chain. Again, the mechanics of this movement is also one of those, like the AU that we mentioned at the beginning, can be difficult to understand when you haven't visited the perspective of the full rotation. And now the reason for this is because, again, we've just taken a 0 point in the middle without exploring the rest of it. So I would say at the same time, I said low bridge slide or rotation progression. Again, mix it up and now and then visit the rotation progression, ensuring that you're getting the same sensations of the load staying in the quadriceps. Now, I'm going to tell you, when I was first practicing this movement, I couldn't understand why my legs were just blown up after every single session I did. I was like, man, I'm just killing my legs. Nothing wrong with my back, nothing wrong with my spine. It's the legs. It's because you're in a position, deep loaded flexion with a lot of load there. When working into the rotation, one thing I will just say is that we'll repeat it with the wall bridge rotation, but you put it together, so hopefully it's shorter. When you're rotating, rotate. And it seems very, very simple, but again, it goes with this idea of the trajectory of the movement. If I'm doing a low bridge rotation, we're talking about rotation in the transverse plane. As kind of, It's kind of a bit difficult to say the transverse plane because if we're using it anatomically as that is, it's kind of not the transverse plane. It's actually, it goes from transverse and then it goes into more of the frontal plane because you're working here. But the idea is the rotation is this way. It's this way. It's a lasso over the top. It's a circle that happens here. This is the rotation. If your low bridge rotation looks like this, where was the rotation? There was no rotation. That was an entry into low bridge and an exit. And there's nothing, I don't say this to say you're doing it wrong, there's a correct way to do it. I'm just putting my point forward that if we use it as a rotational texture, there are many, many benefits that come with it that, in my eyes, looking at the other bridge version where we're just going over the top, it kind of avoids it. And in many cases, it looks like that, the rotation not being there, I'm saying, because it is being avoided. Because then when these people do try the full rotated variation, they find something else that they can dig into, which again is always very exciting. It's a nuance, this kind of rotation aspect, but it basically means as I bring myself around, first of all, you'll have to start to learn the positioning of your hand. Again, this is structure. This is not strength related. This is not necessarily mobility related. This is related to learning your structure. If you put your hand here and you find you can't get in, perhaps you put it too close. If you put it here and you find you're really stretched out, perhaps it's too far away. And this will be part of your practice. The rotational aspect means that when I come down, I look at the hand on the floor, and now you can see my torso is starting to face to the side. Now, in these early progressions, it's okay to sit yourself on the heels here, but keep in mind that if we want to get the full physical potential ultimately further down the road with this movement, sitting on your heels basically means I'm taking off the load in the corners, right? And again, if you're just using this for a movement in the hodder, no one gives two Fs. But if you want to get the mobility development potential from it, as you come back, get that fist or one fist, two fist space in there. The other thing I'll say, there is a variation in the video where the elbow goes on the floor. When I was in Spain, I used to just say solo es por los abuelos. It's just for the grandfathers, the elbow on the floor. Normally, if you're an able-bodied person, do the struggle and keep it off the floor. Because ultimately, if you do want to chase that full rotation, you have to be able to let that shift, finding the middle position, and then rotating back out again. This rotational aspect, I'll show it from the back, and the difference between just going straight over. Going straight over often ends up looking like this. Perfectly functional. But if I can work with this trajectory here, I imagine there's 10 people standing around me. I've got a sword in my hand. I'm going to slice 20 legs off. Yeah. So I have this sword in my hand. I swing it around. This is the texture of the movement. And so, as I said, the low bridge in its isolated form, in its static form, will not make its full sense until you've started visiting it in that rotational context. So don't be afraid to, and don't be afraid to fall. Straddle-up progression, I will not touch on. Straddle-up progression, the importance is more if you have a lot of passive mobility range, you can hurt yourself with this. Be very, very, very mindful. If you have a lot of passive mobility range, which from my experience, when I've worked with yoga teachers or people who've just done yoga for a long time, and they have beautiful splits, and then you put them in a context in which they have to bring themselves up, they believe they have a certain range, but they don't have that range. They can access that range, which is different, but it's not owned. And what happens normally is I'll get video submissions from people and I'm just like, oh my God, you're going to rip your adductors off your pelvis. And it's because they patterned into their mind that, oh yeah, this is a place I'm familiar with. Yeah, it's familiar with it, but you're not friends with it. So if you have more range, I would advise you to start at less. This should always be sub-maximal. I don't really see any benefit in like really burning yourself out in these movements, because no one wants to pull something as fundamental as a leg adductor. I've met people who have, and it's really messed them up for a long period of time. Take it just as ownership. Yeah, I can get up in this position. I got it. How do I know this? Well, you should be able to produce a contraction, quite simply. What is strength? Not contraction. Yeah. So you should be able to produce a contraction. If you find that you're in the position, for example, I come up here and I go, oh, I'm in the position, but I'm kind of like, everything is going to stop. I am just relaxing on my tissues, and this is not going to bring anything valuable other than a flaccid form. So push into the ground. Make sure that you can feel a contraction when you press the feet into the ground. You can even lock the knees out and contract the quadriceps so that you can feel, yes, I have ownership in the position. Hold it for a moment, and most importantly, make sure you can get upright. What do I mean? The very, very common context in which you'll see people working straddle-up like this. Yeah, this is the equivalent of doing a back squat like this. And just coming to here. When you finish your straddle-up, you come up, lock, contract, then the hyperextend, but just here, now I'm in the top position, I own it back down, and you shouldn't fall back to the floor. Likewise, there's a time during the straddle up as you come back down, where here, because you use your hands, if you're using your hands, that you could feel like, oh, now you can just relax. And even though you have the hands on the floor, still feel yourself pressing into the ground, pressing, and then going straight back in, pushing up, boom, lock it out, reach backwards and coming down. Of course, if you're working with elevated variation, you're sitting on a box, absolutely fine. Same idea applies. And you can even flex the knees, as I believe in the video. There's no issues with this whatsoever. But yeah, we'll touch on the bodyweight pancake in a moment. But yeah, this is building ownership over your range of leg abduction. Wall bridge rotation is basically the same perspective as I said with the low bridge rotation. You need to go all the way around. And I still can't, it's always interesting. I recently gave this to a guy who I've been working with for like at least a year and a half with in classes. And then we started doing some programming together. And then I put this in his program, even though he's pretty much on towards doing the full bridge rotation on the floor. And yet he was still cutting the corners. And what do I mean by cutting the corners? I mean, again, this idea of not taking the full rotation. So full rotation, I'm standing away from the wall. This is explicitly written in the video, so you can also look at the video description. I reach out to the wall. I'm working again in the transverse plane, transverse rotation, okay? Remember, sword in my hand, cutting people's legs off. Yeah, this kind of cool move. From here, I rotate toward the wall until I cannot rotate anymore. Look at my arms. I'm reaching, but I can't do it. I'm at maximal torsion. My torso is now facing towards the front. My pelvis is now facing towards the side. This is what we're looking for. The torsional range, the end range of torsion, and I get there, and I can't reach it anymore. So what do I have to do? I lift the fingers. I rotate on my pisiform, maybe I'm a bit higher. I rotate until I can place both hands. It's very important that you find the ownership of that middle position. What can often happen is I go here and then I kind of like, yeah, kind of got the hands a bit, oh yeah, that's fine. Not fine, because you're not patterning it, and then when you want to take it to the floor, the information won't be there. This is a pseudo low bridge rotation. It's a supportive version of the low bridge rotation, so that when you take it to the floor, you may not have the full mobility range, but you've got a pattern, which is, in my mind, what really, really lasts, is the patterning. I rotate into the wall on the pisiform, draw the arc around here, find the stable position. I exit exactly the same way and full rotation. I come back out, I go back in, reach towards the wall, rotate, 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 plant, and then all the way, 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 all the way up. You're here again, and then come out. Those are your marking positions. What is missing the end range torsion is this. Again, I'll say it. Where is the rotation? Where is the rotation? There's no rotation in this movement. That's a backbending movement, which is fine, but it's not the work. It's not the practice. Full rotation in, rotate, twist until you cannot anymore. And likewise, when I exit, the same back, and then come outward. That's all I would like to say and emphasize for the wall bridge rotation. The reason I emphasize it so much is because it is really, really valuable in unlocking the full low bridge rotation. It can really kind of bridge that gap, so to use the word. It can really bridge the gap, and it's because what's missing is the pattern. Because if you don't have access to that range on the floor, you're never going to get to experience it until you develop that range. And that range will take a long time to develop if it's far away from you. It's not going to develop overnight. But the wall bridge rotation, you can do quite immediately. And again, it's another tool that was provided by Ido, and I felt very apt for putting it with this material here. Yeah, if you do have the high bridge rotation, you can work the high bridge rotation on the floor. And if you haven't got it, then you don't. You work with this variation. Okay. The shoulder hole. What a lovely movement. I love this movement. Just to let you know, we'll take an extra 10 minutes. So apologies if that's a big issue, but we get it done. The shoulder hole progression. And in all honesty, this starts to move into those types of movements that I call watch and do, which basically means if you feel you're not getting it, you need to watch more movement. You need to look at the movement and try to discern what is happening in that movement that isn't happening in your movement. And this can be very difficult to do, but it is a skill. It's a skill to develop, to be able to see and go, that thing there. It might be something very, very mechanical, like placing the foot here or keeping the foot on the floor or taking it off or not. Or it might be very intangible, such as your intention. Like, are you intending to go backwards? Are you actually intending to go rotational? This is more internal. So this is quite difficult to deal with, just with like, oh, put your foot here, put that there, put that there. But the one thing I will say is I gave the option of back roll neck loading, which again, I believe was in phase 1, because it should take you high up onto the shoulders towards the neck, which means that for some people, the neck is simply not conditioned for that at this time. What you will be doing in the back roll neck loading, what I would like you to do for using this, is to use it to build the intelligence of the head. The intelligence of the head and the neck. It basically means I know that if I'm in this position here, that if I start moving towards this side, my weight, if I start moving towards this side, my head needs to go to one side, here. But if I go to the other side, as I shift it, the head goes here, and it becomes free. So, I mean, from the back, if it helps, here, I shift my side, and now I have the head free here, yeah? And this is how you work on the neck. This intelligence, which way to put the neck, in actual in the first instance, we feel like it's the opposite. And very often we put the head in the opposite direction, which makes it even tighter and we can't figure out what the hell's going on. So the positioning of the head in this movement is very important, because when I do the first progression, which is the pendulum, check the arm, for example. Are you bringing the arm back here and going through, or is the arm following the leg? Follow this idea. I start from here, I come to the side, I bring myself up. Now, I want to bring myself up high onto the shoulder. I'm not on the back of the neck here. I'm not here like this. I'm up high on the shoulder. I can even bring my head. The weight is coming down and loaded through the side of the shoulder, not on top of my acromial process. This can give a bit of bruising, a bit of rubbing in the initial instances. It can, the skin thickens, you can take up some downward iron vest training, and this might assist you as well. In any case, the reason that we want to be higher on the shoulder is because we want the spine to actually be able to be a bit more erect, because the danger in this, again, is just slumping. And what happens, even if I start doing the full rotation, I come through, and if I'm slumping, it's a very just sunk down movement. There's no flair to it, there's no strength in it. So what I propose then is by coming up onto the shoulder and keeping yourself tight, as you come into the movement, I draw it through from here. I'm high up. I'm tight. Instead of being crouched down here, I'm extending, and then this allows me then to switch the foot. And then that's the most fundamental thing that will help you in this movement, is looking at the left foot when I switch to the left, looking to the right when I switch to the right, and negotiating the head. And the second thing that you'll have to get to grips with is managing your weight across the arms, the back of the arms. Because in very many cases, people's first go-to is the top of the hands for balance. It's not so conducive, sorry, the bottom of the hands, the palms. It's not so conducive to this particular movement. Because when I come into the pendulum roll from here, if I have my hands here, it's actually more difficult to apply pressure to the floor. I have to apply pressure and control by here. By pushing, 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 pushing with those extended arms. So again, that's another thing. If you're struggling with this movement, check how the arms are. And then essentially the end variation, which is the shoulder holé, it's an upside down holé. It's inverted. It's a holé, but it's upside down. And it can be a really, really nice movement. I will give that to people. They will progress through it through all the stages, starting from back roll neck loading to be able to do the shoulder holé, because ultimately the shoulder holé can really keep up the mobility of the neck, as well as a nice floor contact pattern. So essentially you go from the stepping one, you've seen it in the video, but then you're working into, when it's available from here, just keeping the feet in contact. And one of the things that can really help you through that transition is to keep the hips up. The blend, again, it's been drilled in the shoulder bridge from previously. So when I'm coming in, what can happen is people get to here and they're like, all right, what the hell happens next? And they kind of fall down here like this and find themselves sitting, and they're like, oh, what happened? Well, what happened was the hips went down. When I come here, my hips are up. I want to keep them up. Keep them up. That transition right there. I'll do it one more time, because if you're struggling with this, it's useful to know. From here, I come through to keep the hips up, hips up, hips up. And then I can go straight back into the next rotation. Much practice required with this movement. It does unlock a nice amount of freedom, and it's a very, very nice fundamental floor pattern. Bodyweight pancake stretching, we don't need to look at. It's the same as the loaded progression idea, which is in the other webinar. The compression routine, do not cut the reps. Some people, it's very, very difficult in the beginning. When you get a cramp, good. squeeze more into the cramp, so it cramps even more. Point the toes, lock out the knees, and when you're working the compression, in this variation, we're working with the most minimal amount of clearance from the floor, most minimal, just from here. Where elevation is required, make sure you use the elevation, but just be sure, for example, if you're sitting on a block, that you don't put your hands on the floor, you put the hands on the elevated surface, or else this will make the world just seem like it's impossible from here. That's where you would then be able to use the elevation to its greatest effect. That's compression routine. And lastly, infinity figure 8. I'm going to touch on this because it's good for the people I work with as well. Figure 8s, waves, infinity is everywhere in movement. The arcs, the curves, the spirals, the waves, the figure 8s, they're absolutely everywhere. This, as well as being an emptying movement, and this idea again of this kind of centrifugal stretching or the embryonic stretching that it stretches outwards is within this. I would advise you in the beginning to work with this against a wall, just so the banging of the hand against the wall helps you physiological reaction to then tighten your pattern up a little bit. Because what we're looking for with the infinity figure 8 is a circle to the front, a circle to the back. Now, this wasn't so clear in the instructional that I provided because it's not hugely important if it's only for emptying and softening. But the benefit of working with the circle to the front and circle to the back, so from the side, circle to the front, circle to the back, pumping from the knees, is that we are then drilling through and patterning this torsion once again, that we've worked with so many of the other movements that it's good to keep it patterned inside this, very dynamic frame. With the arm, in order to keep the arm completely, quote unquote soft, which basically means I'm not locking it as free from tension as possible, the force is not generated from the arm, which means I don't generate the force by using my arm. Yeah? I generate the force from my connection to the floor, so I have to be earthed. If you're standing like this, with knees locked and your hips are tight, this is not earthed. Sink, bum, sink, bum, and sink. Earth yourself. Slight soft anterior tilt, the hips are free to move. From this position now, I can generate a force. Bum, 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 bum. I can generate it from the floor, not unlike the same as pumping with a surfboard, a snowboard, or a skateboard. Pumps on a surfboard like this, okay? Sit, and you're pumping from here, then it expresses into the arms, but maybe dead, but from here, then what actually happens with this movement, it's a walking pattern, right? It's a one arm walking pattern, and then I add a transverse rotation. It's up and down, and then with manipulation from the torsion between the pelvis and also the torso, which again we saw in the bridge rotation. So with this, what you're going to work on is making sure that you have your axis. It's not tight, but you have your axis here, and you're not getting pulled off of your axis with this arm. And this would mean that you're not able to control the force that you're producing. In order to control that force, I keep it tight in here. Boom, boom, boom. I start slow at first. Catch it, catch it. Try to find that catching point. Just the same as, like, for example, if I have this glass of water here, like this, if I bring it round, water is still in the cup. Catch it, catch it, catch it, catch it, catch it, catch it. Pop, pop, pump it in round. It might be slower. Be mindful if you do have unstable shoulders, like I'm very prone to, that you don't literally throw the shoulder out of the socket. You may need to keep some slight protective tension there. What I do with this, though, as I'm working through my repetitions, feel the blood go through the hand, relax the fingers, let all the sensations go through, and also mapping the scapula as it goes around the back of the rib cage. So be conscious of the patterning when you're doing this. Throwing the arm. Every rep should feel like, something a bit different there. Up, 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 up. Working with the wall in front of you just means that if you're too close, bang, you hit the wall. If you start going out of this trajectory, then it will teach you a valuable lesson. And there's much more that can be said for that. With the emptying and shaking, this is also practice. It's therapeutic, the emptying and shaking at the end, but it's also a practice. It's a coordination. It's a coordination of tension management. So the emptying and shaking, this is something, there's a huge video there that you can use to explore shaking for the entire body. And this Maradona type of hip shaking. This is something that is developed through coordination of knowing where you can release tension and then when tension is needed in its most minimal amount. But the question that should be asked first of all during this practice of emptying and shaking variations is trying to find out, okay, where is the tension? Where am I I was even doing it last night. I was doing work last night, and then I suddenly went, why was I just holding my shoulder up? It happens. It happens. We have to find it. And these shaking variations, the reason I gave these frames is because it's, rather than saying, hey, just shake, right? Shake. No, this is not good enough. We need a practice frame within which to shake. So really work with his ideas. It's really nice just to work with the wrist, first of all. And as in the video, it starts to integrate, it moves up. I would advise you, try working, if you haven't already, 5 minutes non-stop, just working through those shaking variations, and you'll feel the difference. If you spend 10 minutes, so 2 or 3 songs, put on 2 or 3 songs, and just keep shaking, do not stop. If you truly do that, you will feel a prehabilitative sheath over your fascia of the whole body towards the end. Do it for half an hour to an hour, and the next day you will feel like you're wearing some kind of body glove, and a nice, smooth, light, and tension and robustness through all the fascia in your body. It really is a whole practice to itself. But that brings us to the end of the material, as expected. 15 minutes over it. We almost went 3 hours, like a full workshop. Great, I enjoy it. Coming to the end there, are there any questions specifically about the last movements that we looked at? So some of the shoulder hole, straddle up, or the infinity figure 8 arms. Any questions?
The emptying and the shaking, is that something you can do when strength training or strength practice?
Sorry, Chris, can you say once again?
I said the emptying and the shaking, is that something you can do if you're doing more strength-based practices in between your in between the movements? Definitely.
Make it so that it's needed, because I'll tell you already now, Chris, it's needed. It's needed, but until you've practiced it and felt it, you don't know that you need it. It's done naturally. You'll do this. Maybe you've done some sets of bicep curls or something, just afterwards, you're kind of just like this. But it's not really conscious. You kind of just do this. Back in the day, if you look at the old bodybuilding books or the physical culture books from, for example, like India, one of the things that Vishnu Ghosh, who then was the guy who spoke about the abdominal manipulation, and it was very a physiological thing, and then his brother, Swami Yogananda, who took it to the West, then used it for this Nauli thing because it was very eye-catching to the West, and he made it part of the protocols. But in any case, this guy, he would always standard program, always between your sets from like strength training and stuff, always massage and shake the muscles. Or even Earl Liederman, 1920s, strength business is when strong guys were strong. When they used to lift literally 2 people over their head with 1 arm. This kind of stuff. Earl Liederman, you read in his books, Secrets of Strength. He'll say, in the middle of your set, constantly massage the muscles, take care of the tissue, shake it out. Been completely forgotten. So it's taking care of the most fundamental thing. It's your the engines. Those little contractors. There's little filaments. Shaking, as well as being therapeutic as well, I will emphasize as well, in practice, it's coordinative. It helps you build coordination between certain things in your body. Because, for example, I have a shake here, I can isolate it to the wrist, then to the forearm, into the rest of the body. It can then affect the rest of it, and then it goes down here. And it's essentially being able to regulate your on-off switch. That's all you can do, contract and relax.